The letter arrived like a slap, its crisp edges slicing through Julian's morning. "You are not welcome at Grandma Rosa's funeral," it read, the words in his mother's sharp handwriting. Julian, 28, stood frozen in his San Francisco apartment, the city's fog curling outside his window like a ghost of the family he'd lost. What does it mean to be cast out by those who raised you? How does a heart keep beating when the people who taught it to love now reject it? Julian traced the letter's words, each one a fresh wound, as he grappled with the sting of his family's ultimatum. His identity as a gay man was a sin they couldn't forgive, even in death's shadow. He sank onto his couch, the weight of memory pulling him under. Grandma Rosa had been his anchor. Her kitchen always smelled of sage and cornbread, her laughter a melody that softened the edges of his childhood in Atlanta. She'd never cared about his boyfriends, only that he was happy. "Live true, Jules," she'd whisper, her eyes twinkling. But now her funeral was in 2 days, and his mother, Evelyn, had barred him from saying goodbye. The family's church, rigid and unforgiving, had won. Across the room, Mateo, Julian's partner of 3 years, watched quietly. At 29, Mateo carried a quiet strength, his brown eyes sharp with empathy. A social worker from Oakland, he'd seen pain like this before. Families torn apart by fear disguised as faith. "What do you want to do?" Mateo asked, his voice soft but steady. "What would you do if the people you loved most turned their backs on you?" Julian didn't answer right away. His mind churned with questions. Could he defy his family's orders? Was there a way to honor Rosa without shattering what little connection remained? He thought of her stories about the civil rights marches she joined in the 60s, her fierce belief in standing up for what was right. "I have to go," he said finally, his voice trembling but resolute. "I owe her that." Mateo nodded, pulling out his laptop. "Then we're going to Atlanta." He started searching for flights, his fingers moving with purpose. But Julian's phone buzzed, a text from his cousin, Lila, the only family member who'd stayed in touch. "Jules, I'm so sorry. Aunt Evelyn's serious. They'll kick you out if you show up." The warning stung, but it also lit a spark. Why should he let their rejection define his grief? Julian's eyes met Mateo's, and in that shared glance, a plan began to form. They'd need more than courage. They'd need a way to get there without detection. As Mateo scrolled through airline options, a notification popped up. A small airline, Unity Air, had a last-minute deal to Atlanta. The website boasted a tagline, "We fly for everyone." Something about it felt like a sign. Julian leaned closer, his heart racing. "Book it," he said. "What risks would you take to honor someone you loved?" The next morning, they boarded a red-eye flight from San Francisco International. The cabin hummed with quiet anticipation, passengers settling into their seats. Julian clutched Rosa's old silver locket, a gift from her youth, now a talisman against the uncertainty ahead. Mateo reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "We'll figure this out," Mateo whispered. But doubt gnawed at Julian. His family's church was a fortress of tradition, its congregation tight-knit and suspicious of outsiders. Evelyn had always been the enforcer, her faith a blade she wielded with precision. Would she really turn him away at the funeral? And what would it cost him to face that rejection in person? As the plane ascended, Julian stared out the window, the city lights fading into the night. He thought of Rosa's stories, her defiance, her love. "Live true," she'd said. But how do you stay true when the world demands you hide? The answer, he realized, wasn't in Atlanta. It was in the choice to go, to stand tall, to love without shame. The flight attendant, a young woman named Aisha, noticed Julian's tension. "First time to Atlanta?" she asked, her smile warm. Julian nodded, unsure how to explain. Aisha leaned in, her voice low. "I don't know your story, But I've seen that look before. Whatever you're facing, you're not alone. Her words, simple but sincere, felt like a lifeline. What does it mean to find allies in unexpected places? Julian glanced at Matteo, who was already sketching out a plan to navigate the funeral discreetly. They'd need to blend in, avoid confrontation, and find a way to pay respects without sparking a scene. But as the plane soared closer to Atlanta, a new question burned. What if his family wasn't the only force at play? The Atlanta airport buzzed with morning chaos, travelers weaving through terminals like threads in a loom. Julian and Matteo stepped off the plane, the weight of their mission settling heavier with each step. Julian's heart pounded. Every stranger's glance felt like a judgment. Every step closer to the funeral a step toward confrontation. What do you do when the place you once called home feels like a battlefield? Julian clutched Rose's locket tighter, its cool metal grounding him. Matteo, sensing his unease, squeezed his hand. We're here for her, he reminded him. Not them. They rented a car and drove toward Decatur, where Rose's church stood like a sentinel of Julian's past. The city was a mix of old and new, sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss alongside sleek coffee shops. Julian's memories flooded back. Summer barbecues, Rose's garden, her voice calling him to dinner. But now those memories clashed with the reality of his exile. At a gas station, Julian's phone buzzed again. Another text from Lila. They're watching for you. Be careful. The warning sent a chill down his spine. Who was they? His mother? The church elders? Or something more coordinated? He showed Matteo, whose jaw tightened. We need a plan B, Matteo said, pulling out his phone to search for nearby motels. What would you do if you knew you were walking into a trap? Julian's mind raced. They couldn't just show up at the church, they needed a way to blend in, to slip through the cracks. Matteo suggested posing as distant relatives, but Julian shook his head. They know everyone. We need something else. Back at the airport, Aisha, the flight attendant, had slipped Julian a card with her number and a note. Call if you need help. It seemed like a small gesture, but now it felt like a lifeline. Julian hesitated, then dialed. Aisha, it's Julian from the flight. We're in trouble. He explained the situation, the funeral, the ban, the fear of being turned away. Aisha's voice was calm but firm. Unity Air has a network here. We've dealt with situations like this before. Families, prejudice, all of it. Meet me at the community center on Peachtree Street in an hour. What does it mean to trust a stranger when your own family betrays you? Julian agreed, hope flickering like a candle in the wind. The community center was a low brick building, its walls covered in murals of diverse faces and clasped hands. Aisha greeted them, her uniform swapped for jeans and a bright scarf. We've got a plan, she said, leading them to a small office where two others waited. Marcus, a burly black man in his 40s who ran the center, and Elena, a trans woman in her 30s with a sharp wit and a laptop full of local contacts. Unity Air isn't just an airline, Marcus explained. We're a collective, pilots, attendants, ground crew, who help people in situations like yours. Families can be cruel, but we've got your back. Elena chimed in, pulling up a map of the church. There's a side entrance nobody uses. We can get you in during the service, unnoticed. Julian's chest tightened with gratitude, but doubt lingered. Could they really pull this off? What if his mother spotted him? What if the church turned him away? Or worse? Matteo, ever practical, asked about logistics, timing, exits, backup plans. Aisha outlined a strategy, disguises, borrowed IDs, and a distraction to keep the congregation's focus elsewhere. As they planned, Julian's thoughts drifted to Rosa. She'd always been the one to bridge divides, to love without conditions. Would she approve of this deception? Or would she tell him to walk in boldly, head high? The question gnawed at him as they left the center, armed with a plan and a fragile hope. That night, in a motel room, Julian and Matteo lay side by side, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. "What if this doesn't work?" Julian whispered. Matteo turned to him, his eyes steady. "Then we'll find another way to honor her. Together." Their hands found each other in the dark, a quiet promise against the storm ahead. What does it mean to fight for love in a world that tries to tear it apart? As Julian drifted to sleep, Rose's voice echoed in his mind. Live true Jules. Tomorrow he'd face his family, his fears, and the truth of who he was. But for now, he held on to Matteo, their love a shield against the unknown. The morning of the funeral dawned gray, Atlanta's skies heavy with the threat of rain. Julian stood in front of the motel mirror, adjusting the borrowed suit Aisha had provided. It was slightly too big, but it hid his identity, along with the fake ID labeling him as James Carter, a distant cousin. What does it feel like to hide who you are, to mourn someone you love? Julian's reflection stared back, a stranger in his own skin. Matteo, dressed similarly, stood behind him, his presence a steady anchor. "You ready?" he asked. Julian nodded, though his heart screamed otherwise. They drove to the church, parking a block away to avoid suspicion. The building loomed ahead, its white steeple piercing the clouds. Julian's stomach churned as memories flooded back. Sunday services, Rose's hand in his, the choir's hymns. Now it felt like enemy territory. Aisha met them at the side entrance, her eyes scanning the street. "The distraction's in place," she whispered. "Elena's got a group staging a small protest out front. Nothing big, just enough to draw attention." Julian's pulse quickened. What kind of courage does it take to sneak into your own family's grief? Inside, the church was a sea of somber faces, the air thick with incense and hushed voices. Julian and Matteo slipped into a back pew, heads down, blending with the crowd. The casket, draped in white roses, sat at the altar, Rose's final resting place. Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to run to it, to touch it, to whisper his goodbye. But then he saw her, Evelyn, his mother, standing near the front, her face a mask of stoic grief. Her eyes scanned the room, sharp and unyielding. Julian ducked lower, his heart hammering. Had she seen him? Would she know? Matteo's hand brushed his, a silent reminder. They were in this together. The service began, the pastor's voice booming about legacy and salvation. Julian barely listened, his eyes fixed on the casket. He thought of Rose's stories, her laughter, her unwavering love. She'd never cared that he was gay. Why did the rest of the family? What makes a family choose dogma over love? A commotion outside broke his thoughts. Shouts, then chanting. Elena's protest had begun. Heads turned, murmurs rippling through the congregation. Aisha, stationed near the door, gave Julian a subtle nod. It was time. They moved quickly, weaving through the side aisle toward the casket. Julian's breath hitched as he reached it, his fingers brushing the smooth wood. "I'm here, Grandma," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "I love you." Matteo stood guard, his eyes scanning for trouble. But trouble found them. "Julian?" A voice hissed. It was his cousin, Marcus, not the ally from the community center, but a loyalist to Evelyn's rules. His eyes narrowed, recognition dawning. "You shouldn't be here." Julian froze. "What do you say when your truth is laid bare?" "I had to," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. "She was my family too." Marcus hesitated, torn between loyalty and something softer, memory, perhaps, of the cousin he'd once known. Before Marcus could act, Aisha appeared, her voice calm but firm. "He's with me," she said, flashing a fake family badge. Marcus frowned but backed off, distracted by the growing noise outside. Julian exhaled, his hand still on the casket. He'd done it, he'd said goodbye. But as they slipped back toward the exit, Evelyn's voice cut through the crowd. "Stop!" she called, her eyes locking onto Julian's. The room seemed to still, every face turning toward them. What happens when the truth you've hidden demands to be seen? Julian stood tall, Matteo at his side. "I'm here for Rosa," he said, his voice carrying over the silence. "You can't take that from me." Evelyn's face twisted, grief, anger, shame, but she didn't move. The congregation watched, some with curiosity, others with judgment. Aisha guided them out, her presence a shield. As they reached the door, Julian glanced back, memorizing the casket, the roses, the family he might never see again. What does it cost to choose love over acceptance? He didn't know yet, but he'd made his choice. The church doors swung shut behind them, the cool Atlanta air hitting Julian like a wave. He and Matteo hurried to the car, Aisha close behind, her eyes scanning for any pursuit. The protest outside had grown louder. Elena's group chanting about love and equality, their voices a defiant harmony against the church's silence. What does freedom feel like when it's tinged with loss? Julian's heart was a tangle of relief and sorrow. He'd honored Rosa, but the cost was real. His mother's glare, the congregation's stares, the finality of a door closing on his past. Matteo took the wheel, his calm focus grounding Julian as they sped away. Aisha, in the back seat, checked her phone. "You're clear for now," she said. "But Evelyn might not let this go. She's got influence in that church." Julian nodded, his mind replaying her voice. "Stop!" And the way it had cracked, just for a moment. Was it anger or something deeper? Regret? He pushed the thought away. They returned to the community center, where Marcus and Elena waited. "You did it," Elena said, her smile wide. "Not many people would have had the guts." Marcus handed Julian a coffee, his expression softer now. "Rosa would have been proud," he said. "She always talked about you, you know?" Julian's eyes stung. What does it mean to carry someone's love when they're gone? He opened Rosa's locket, revealing a tiny photo of her smiling, her arm around a younger Julian. "She was my home," he said, his voice breaking. Matteo wrapped an arm around him, silent but steady. But the moment of peace was short-lived. Aisha's phone buzzed with a message from a Unity Air contact. Evelyn had called the airline, demanding to know if Julian had been on the flight. She'd guessed their plan, or someone had tipped her off. "She's trying to track you," Aisha said, her tone grim. "She might show up at the airport. What do you do when the past refuses to let you go?" Julian's mind raced. They couldn't stay in Atlanta. Evelyn's reach was too long, her anger too raw, but running felt like surrender, like letting her win. Matteo, ever the strategist, suggested a new plan. Fly out on a different airline under different names to throw her off. Aisha shook her head. "Unity Air's got you covered. We've got a private charter leaving tonight off the books. It's risky, but it'll get you out safely." Julian hesitated. Trusting strangers had brought them this far, but a private flight? It felt like something out of a movie, too big for his small, fractured life. "Why are you doing this?" he asked Aisha. She smiled, her eyes warm. "Because I've been where you are. My family didn't get me either, but I found a new one. Unity's that for a lot of us." Her words hit Julian hard. A reminder that family wasn't just blood, but the people who chose you. They spent the day at the center, laying low. Elena shared stories of other Unity Air missions, helping a trans teen escape a hostile home, flying a lesbian couple to safety after a hate crime. Each story wove a thread of hope, a reminder that Julian and Matteo weren't alone. But as evening fell, tension returned. The charter flight was their only way out, and every passing hour felt like a countdown. At dusk, they drove to a small airstrip outside the city. The plane was a sleek, unmarked jet, its crew a mix of Unity Air volunteers. The pilot, a gruff woman named Carla, gave Julian a nod. "We don't leave anyone behind," she said. "What does it mean to be seen when you've spent so long hiding?" As they boarded, Julian glanced at Matteo, his heart swelling. This man, who'd stood by him through every storm, was his family now. They buckled in, the plane's engines humming to life. But just as the doors closed, headlights flashed in the distance. A car speeding toward the airstrip. Julian's breath caught. Was it Evelyn? Had she found them? The crew moved quickly, the plane taxiing toward the runway. What do you hold onto when the past comes chasing? Julian gripped Matteo's hand, Rosa's locket pressed against his chest, as the plane lifted into the night. The plane climbed into the Atlanta night, its lights fading below like stars swallowed by clouds. Julian's heart raced, his eyes fixed on the window, half expecting to see Evelyn's car chasing them down the runway. Matteo's hand stayed in his, a quiet anchor against the storm of what-ifs. What does it mean to leave behind the only home you've known? Julian thought of Rosa, her locket warm against his skin. He'd said his goodbye, but the cost was a family he might never reclaim. Yet, as the plane leveled out, a strange peace settled over him. He'd honored her, defied the ban, and found allies in strangers who'd become family. Carla's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're clear. Welcome aboard Unity's Freedom Flight." The crew cheered softly, and Aisha, seated nearby, flashed a grin. "Told you we'd get you out." Julian managed to smile, but questions lingered. What now? Where did they go from here? Matteo, sensing his unease, leaned closer. "We're going home," he said, his voice steady. "San Francisco, our life, our people." But Julian wondered, could home exist without roots? Without Rosa? Without the family he'd once believed in? The flight was smooth, the night sky a canvas of possibilities. Aisha shared more about Unity Air's mission, how they'd started as a small group of airline workers helping marginalized travelers, how they'd grown into a network spanning cities. "You're part of it now," she told Julian. "Your story matters. What does it mean to find belonging when you've been cast out?" Julian thought of Rosa's lessons, her courage, her defiance, her love. She taught him to live true, and he had. But the ache of his mother's rejection lingered, a wound that might never fully heal. Back in San Francisco, they landed at a private airstrip, the city's fog welcoming them like an old friend. Aisha and the crew escorted them to a safe house, a cozy apartment run by Unity volunteers. There, Julian and Matteo sat together, the weight of the past days settling around them. "I thought I'd feel whole after this," Julian admitted, his voice soft. "But I just feel different." Matteo nodded, his eyes gentle. "You're allowed to feel that. You faced them, Jules. You showed up for Rosa, for yourself. What does it mean to rebuild after loss?" Julian opened Rosa's locket, tracing her photo. He realized then that her love hadn't died. It lived in him, in Matteo, in the strangers who'd risked so much to help. Family wasn't just blood. It was the people who saw you, who chose you, who fought for you. Days later, Julian received an email from Lila. "Mom's struggling," she wrote. "She didn't expect you to show up." I think it shook her. The words sparked a flicker of hope, but Julian wasn't ready to reach out. Not yet. Healing, he knew, would take time. For him, for Evelyn, for the family they might one day rebuild. He and Matteo started volunteering with Unity Air, helping others like them navigate their own battles. Each mission was a reminder. Love could be a revolution, a quiet act of defiance against a world that tried to break it. Julian wore Rosa's locket every day, a symbol of the truth he'd chosen to live. One evening, as they stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Julian turned to Matteo. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for being my home." Matteo smiled, pulling him close. "Always. What does it mean to love fiercely in a world that resists it?" Julian didn't have all the answers, but as the waves crashed below, he knew one thing. He'd keep living true, for Rosa, for Matteo, for himself. And that was enough.